Hello and welcome to everyone joining us on Zoom and Facebook Live for the Nancy and David Wolf Holocaust and Humanities Center's weekly Holocaust Speaker Series. My name is Trinity Johnson and I am the Director of Stewardship here at the Center. A little bit about our museum. We are located in Cincinnati, Ohio, Cincinnati's historic Union Terminal, which is actually a historic train station, the very train station that when Holocaust survivors arrived to Cincinnati by train, they arrived in this very building. So if you're ever in the Cincinnati area, we hope you will stop by and see our museum, which is designed all around local stories of survivors and their families who came to this country through Cincinnati's Union Terminal and beyond to rebuild their lives in our community. And I'd also like to thank our sponsors of the speaker series, Michael and Margaret Valentine. Thank you for ensuring that we continue to share stories even outside of our museum walls. And thank you so much to each of you for being with us this week. A couple housekeeping tips. We are in a webinar format, meaning you can hear and see us, but we cannot hear or see you. However, at the end, if we have time today, we will take questions from the audience. And so we hope you will submit questions in the chat or the Q&A function. And I'm very excited to welcome our speaker this week, Dan Ottenheimer, who tells the story of his father, Fritz Ottenheimer. And Dan started telling his story in 2021 after he joined the Generation Speakers Bureau at the Holocaust Center of Pittsburgh, which I also would like to thank my colleagues in Pittsburgh for connecting me with Dan so that we could share this story with our community as well. So Dan, thank you so much for being with us today and sharing this very important story with our community. And make sure you tell people where you're coming to us from, because it's also not Pittsburgh. So this is a wonderful example of how we can share these stories of history and legacy wherever we are. And we're just so thankful for you being with us today. Thanks, Dan.
Thanks. Thank you all very much for inviting me to join you today to tell you about my dad, Fritz Ottenheimer, about what it was like to be a Jewish child growing up in Nazi Germany. So I'm joining you today from just outside of Boston, Massachusetts, the town of Arlington. But I grew up in Western Pennsylvania in a quiet suburb east of Pittsburgh called Forest Hills. And when I was growing up, I thought we were an ordinary family, that there was nothing different about my dad, that he was like all of my friends' dads. I didn't know that he was a Holocaust survivor who had fled from Germany in 1939. My dad wanted me and my sister to have ordinary childhoods untouched by his past, so he refused to talk about it. I did have a few clues, though, a few pieces of the puzzle about my dad's past. I knew that my grandfather, who lived in New York at the time, had been a soldier for the German army during World War I. I knew that my dad had been born in Germany, but that he was a US soldier during World War II. I knew we were Jewish. We belonged to a synagogue in the Squirrel Hill section of Pittsburgh. And I knew that a lot of Jews had been killed by the Nazis during World War II. So I knew these facts, but I never really tried to understand the big picture or to understand what I didn't know. I never wondered about what my dad's life was like in Germany and how he came to be here in the US. So I graduated from high school and then I came up here to the Boston area to go to college. And a few years after that, my dad changed his mind. He decided it was time to share his story. I think he changed his mind about when my sister had her first kid, because my dad realized that his grandchildren would never know anything about what happened to him if he stayed silent. So my dad started to write his memoirs, and then he became a volunteer speaker for the Holocaust Center of Pittsburgh. And over the next several years, I learned his story as I got to hear him speak it several times. My dad spent more than 30 years telling his story, primarily at schools and organizations in Western Pennsylvania. But in 2015, when my dad turned 90, he developed a number of serious health issues. That's when I realized the responsibility to tell these stories was going to be passing to the next generation soon. My dad passed away in 2017, and then my mom passed away in 2018. And it was a sad coincidence that my mom passed away just a few days after the shooting in 2018 at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Squirrel Hill. So I spent a week there in Squirrel Hill while that whole community was in mourning. In 2019, I started to volunteer here in the Boston area as a second-generation Holocaust speaker. And then a year or so after that, I realized that since all of my talks were being done over Zoom and online, that I could also be a volunteer back in Pittsburgh. So I contacted the Holocaust Center of Pittsburgh and volunteered to be part of their Generations speaker program. And then this summer, when the Holocaust and Humanities Center in Cincinnati asked the Holocaust Center of Pittsburgh if they knew of a speaker who felt comfortable using Zoom to be a Zoom speaker, they contacted me and I quickly volunteered. And so that's how I'm here with you today over Zoom to share some of my dad's stories with you. Now, I noticed that the Holocaust and Humanities Center has a very strong upstander program. And the organization that I volunteer for here in Boston, known as Facing History and Ourselves, they're also very focused on upstanders and standing up for injustice. So when I share my dad's stories, I often include several stories about the upstanders, and I'll be sharing those stories with you as well. So let me get started. My dad was born in 1925 in Konstanz, Germany. Now, Konstanz is located way down on the southern edge of Germany, right on the border of Switzerland. And at the time, it had a population of about 35,000. My dad had a very typical childhood and a very typical family. He lived with his parents, my grandparents, my Oma and Opa, and his big sister, Ilza, my Aunt Ilza. My grandfather owned a men's clothing store in Konstanz. The family lived in an apartment and they didn't own a car, and those were very typical for that time period in Germany. My dad's neighbors and schoolmates were mostly Christian, and that's because less than 2% of the Konstanz population was Jewish. But my dad didn't think that was odd. That was just happened to be how things were. And he had that ordinary childhood. He played with his big sister. He played with the neighborhood kids. His favorite sports were hiking and soccer. My dad went to public elementary school, and he also went to religious school once a week and went to Shabbat services once a week at the Konstanz Synagogue. All of that changed in 1933, which was the year that Hitler came to power. My dad turned 8 years old that year, and life for my dad got very bad very quickly, as it did for all of the Jews in Germany. The radio stations in Konstanz started to play propaganda all day, and that included condemning the Jews, accusing them of being the enemies of Germany. The Konstanz newspapers started to print articles that accused local Jewish residents of having committed illegal or immoral acts. Sound trucks started to cruise through Konstanz, broadcasting anti-Jewish propaganda, including telling people not to buy from Jewish-owned stores. And then guards, stormtroopers, were posted outside of Jewish-owned stores, there to intimidate shoppers. And that included my grandfather's store. There were a lot of changes at my dad's school. All of the students had to attend a class called Race Studies class. And there, they were taught about the alleged superiority of the Aryan race, along with the dangers of the inferior races, in particular the Jews. After school, all of the other students went to Hitler Youth meetings, and those were filled with more propaganda along with paramilitary training. There were weekly assemblies at the school. All of the students would go into the school auditorium and listen to one of Hitler's speeches. And of course, those speeches were filled with all sorts of hateful rhetoric towards the Jews, accusing them of being thieves and of supporting the enemies of Germany. Then the students were taught these new songs that were supposedly patriotic, but were really very anti-Jewish. My dad remembered the lyrics for one of them in particular. It went, "When Jewish blood squirts from the knife, everything is going well." So imagine how my dad must have felt standing in an auditorium filled with kids where all of the other students are singing one of these songs about stabbing Jews. The government started to announce new laws, all designed to discriminate against the Jews. And they got progressively worse over time. Eventually, it got to the point where my dad was no longer allowed to go to the movie theater. My dad wasn't allowed to go to concerts. He and all the other Jews weren't allowed to attend any sporting events. He couldn't use the town swimming pools. My dad and his family weren't allowed to eat at the town restaurants. And if they went on a trip, they weren't allowed to stay in hotels. My dad couldn't even sit on the town's park benches. So these changes were all really very bewildering to my dad. He couldn't understand what was going on. One day, my dad and his family were listening to the radio when the commentator started to talk to his listeners about German Jews. The commentator explained that Jews were devious, corrupt, and unscrupulous, that they were a dirty, smelly foreign race, and that they were conspiring to destroy Germany. My dad turned to his parents and said to them, "That radio announcer, is he talking about us? Aren't we Jewish?" And my grandparents said, "Don't listen to that idiot. He's one of those Nazis. The German people are honest, decent, educated people. They won't believe these horrible lies." Well, my grandparents were wrong. Although some of the neighbors and townspeople didn't believe the propaganda, many others started to believe it. My dad remembered another time. A neighbor came over to their apartment to do some repairs, and he was wearing a little Nazi emblem on a lapel pin. My grandfather asked him why he was wearing it, and the neighbor said he wanted to support the government's efforts to straighten out the country. So then my grandfather asked the neighbor, how did he think about how the government was treating all of the German Jews? And the neighbor replied, "Well, I guess it's unfortunate that the good Jews have to suffer along with the bad." So my grandfather asked him next, "Which ones are we? Are we the good Jews or are we the bad Jews?" And the neighbor said, "Oh, what are you talking about? Of course, you're the good Jews. You're wonderful people." So then my grandfather asked this neighbor, "You know most of the Jews here in Konstanz. Which of them are the bad Jews that we good Jews need to suffer along with?" And the neighbor thought about this for a while. And finally, he admitted that all of the Jews that he knew in Konstanz were good, honest people. Well, then my grandfather asked, "Where are the bad Jews?" And this finally got the neighbor upset. He said, "What are you talking about? Of course there are bad Jews. There's bad Jews everywhere. You read the newspaper, you listen to the radio, there's story after story about all the bad Jews in Konstanz and throughout Germany." So that was the power of this government-sponsored anti-Jewish propaganda. Lots of people wound up believing the propaganda was true, even when right in front of their own eyes, if they bothered to look, they could see that the propaganda was false. Fortunately, not everyone in Konstanz believed the propaganda. And I promised you a couple upstander stories, so I'm going to share a couple with you right now. You may have wondered about my dad's schoolmates. They were being inundated with propaganda, going to race studies class, attending Hitler youth meetings, going to these school assemblies and listening to Hitler speeches, learning these terrible songs. But at the end of the day, they would still come over to my dad's apartment, knock on the door, and ask if my dad could come out and play with them. All the propaganda didn't do anything to change their friendships. Eventually, though, my dad's friends were ordered by their parents to stop playing with my dad. But even though they weren't allowed to play together anymore, they still used to walk to and from school together as an act of friendship, solidarity, and maybe a little bit of defiance. This other story I have for you is actually the only story that I knew when I was growing up in Pittsburgh. And I knew this story not because my dad told it to me. He never talked about Germany. This was the story that my grandfather used to share with my sister and me. It took place shortly after Hitler came to power. On this day, as my grandfather did on almost every day, he left the apartment building in the morning and proceeded to walk to his store, his clothing store, to open it up for the day. But on this day, as he approached the store, he saw standing outside the store for the very first time was a German stormtrooper. So my grandfather immediately turned around and went back to his apartment. And he proceeded to find his World War I service medals. Then he walked back to the store, this time opened up the store, went inside, and put all of his medals on display in one of the big display windows that he had. Then my grandfather came back outside the store and rolled up his shirt sleeve. Now, it turned out that when my grandfather served in the German army during World War I, he had been wounded in battle. While out on a patrol, a bullet had gone through his arm, shattering it, leaving it so he could no longer bend his elbow and leaving him with a very large scar. So my grandfather rolled up his shirt sleeve, exposing the scar, and stood outside his store and waited. It wasn't long before the first townsperson walked by. Turns out the first upstander. This person looked at the stormtrooper, looked at the window with the medals, looked at my grandfather and his scar. And then he turned to the stormtrooper and said to him, "You're making a big mistake. Mr. Ottenheimer is a war hero. He was wounded in battle. He deserves our thanks and our support, not our scorn." Well, the stormtrooper tried to avoid making eye contact. He stared straight ahead and ignored the townsperson. But then a second person came by and a third person came by. And each of them tried to explain to the stormtrooper that what he was doing was wrong. More and more people gathered and their voices got louder and louder. And eventually the stormtrooper realized that he had failed in his objective of intimidation. And so he left his post. That week, and for the next couple weeks, business at my grandfather's store actually picked up because the townspeople went out of their way to show their support for my grandfather and to shop at his store. So this was a period of time when the upstanders could make a difference, when the townspeople stood up to injustice. And it was something that my grandfather remembered for the rest of his life. Eventually, though, business at my grandfather's store started to decline. People became afraid to shop there. So business dwindled and dwindled, and finally, my grandfather had no choice, but he had to sell the store. Briefly, he got another job as a traveling tie salesman, but then he lost that job as well because he was Jewish. So my dad and his family put up with this discrimination, this persecution as best they could for a few years. But finally, they realized that it wasn't going to be getting any better anytime soon. In fact, it was likely to get worse. So 3 years after Hitler came to power, in 1936, my grandparents contacted relatives that they had here in the United States and asked if they would sponsor the family for immigration to the US. The relatives agreed, so my grandparents put together these long, complex application and sent it in to the US consulate to apply for immigration to the US. What that did, however, was put them on a very long waiting list because there were a lot of German Jews trying to come to the United States. And the US had a very limited quota of German immigrants who were allowed to come to the US every year. And they weren't even filling that quota back in 1936, 1937. It took 2 years of enduring more persecution. But finally, in the spring of 1938, the US consulate in Stuttgart informed my dad's family that their application to immigrate to the US had come up for review. It had come up for review and been denied. My dad guessed that the reason that it was denied was because the consulate officials had noticed that my grandfather had that injury that he had suffered during World War I. And they were afraid that he wasn't going to be able to get a job when he came to the US. So my grandparents quickly contacted their US relatives and got them to put up a larger financial guarantee. And with this larger financial backing, they reapplied to immigrate to the US, which put them back on the waiting list. So this is spring, summer of 1938, and they're back on the waiting list, waiting, hoping that their second application will come through soon. 1938 was very eventful for my dad's family. March of 1938 was when Germany annexed Austria. Germany just announced that they were going to annex Austria, and the German army marched into Austria, and the Austrian government didn't try to stop it at all. Austria was now part of Germany. It wasn't long after that, I don't know, a few days, a week or so, there was a knock on my dad's apartment door. When they opened the door, they saw standing there was a family. And the family explained that they were from Austria. They were Jews from Austria, and they had tried to check into the hotel in Konstanz, but they were told that Jews weren't allowed to stay in hotels in Germany. But the hotel manager suggested they come over to the Ottenheimer apartment, that the Ottenheimers would be able to put them up for the night. So there they were. My dad's family invited them into the apartment, fed them dinner, and heard their story. The Austrian Jewish family said that they were forced out of their home in Vienna by their neighbors, who then proceeded to ransack their home. And while this was happening, the Austrian police had just stood by and watched and done nothing to stop it. The Austrian Jewish family felt lucky that they had escaped unharmed. I think they'd managed to grab a couple of articles of clothing. They had decided that they were going to flee into Switzerland. Now, that wasn't actually all that easy to do. Although Switzerland shared a border with Austria, just as Switzerland shared a border with Germany, it was quite difficult to sneak over that border into Switzerland. And that's because the Rhine River and Lake Constance formed a very strong natural barrier to make it difficult to get over the boundary. Except, of course, at one of the official border crossings, which was usually at bridges. However, the Austrian Jewish family didn't have any of the necessary paperwork that would allow them to legally cross into Switzerland. They had just run out of their home and hadn't grabbed anything, really. So they had come to Constance because they were hoping that they could find a way to sneak over the border. Well, my dad's family put this Austrian Jewish family up for the night. And the next morning, the two families went for a walk. They were walking for a while until they got to a field. And then my grandfather pointed to a stream in the middle of the field and said, "Do you see that stream? That is the border between Germany and Switzerland." What my grandfather had done was taken them all for a walk to a special part of Constance. It was called the Altstadt, or the Old City. And the Old City portion of Constance was actually located on the south side of the Rhine River. In fact, it's the only part of Germany located south of the Rhine. Well, the Austrian Jewish family couldn't believe their good fortune. They hopped over this little stream and they were free in Switzerland. They must have contacted some of their friends back in Vienna, Austria, because a few days later, there was another knock on my dad's apartment door. It was another Austrian Jewish family. And over the next several weeks, there was a steady stream of Austrian refugees coming to my dad's apartment, spending the night there, and then being shown the way to Switzerland the next day. One day, there was a knock on the door. When they opened it, they found standing there was not a family. It was a Constance police inspector. The police inspector invited himself in, and after some small talk, explained why he was there. "I know what you're doing," he said. "You're helping to smuggle Austrian Jews into Switzerland. I'd like to help, but my help will cost a certain amount of money per person." My grandparents were very alarmed by this conversation. The amount of money he was asking for was the equivalent of a couple dollars, ridiculously small. And it was very dangerous for a Jew to say no to law enforcement back then in Germany. So my grandparents agreed. And then the next morning, as agreed upon, all of the Austrian Jewish families who had been staying overnight with my dad's family all came out of the apartment building down to the street. There, as agreed upon, was the Constance police inspector. The Austrian families handed over the money that had been requested, and the police inspector handed back official documentation giving them permission to cross the border. Then the policeman handed all of the money to the taxi cab drivers who were waiting on the street. The money was cab fare. The families climbed into the cabs, were driven to the border, waved through with the paperwork all in order, and they were free in Switzerland. And this new arrangement continued for another several weeks until the Swiss government decided to completely shut down their border and proceeded to deport back to Germany anyone who they found had entered the country illegally. All in all, my dad's family and this Constance police inspector helped some 300 Austrian Jewish refugees find their way to freedom in Switzerland. And I view this police inspector as a true upstander, someone who is willing to risk his career as well as undoubtedly the health and safety of his family in order to help these Austrian Jews find safety in Switzerland. 1938 was eventful for another reason for my family. Kristallnacht. My dad remembered Kristallnacht very clearly. It was November 10th, 1938, and my dad was 13 years old. He was sleeping in their apartment. But in the middle of the night, he woke up suddenly because he thought he heard an explosion. He ran to the apartment's window and looked out and saw that the Konstanz synagogue was in flames. Then, later that day, 2 Gestapo agents came to my dad's apartment, informed them that they were there to arrest my grandfather, refused to explain why he was under arrest, and took my grandfather away. This, of course, was a scene that played out across all of Germany on Kristallnacht. Jewish stores vandalized, Jewish synagogues burned down, Jewish men rounded up and taken away from their families. My grandmother spent the next several weeks desperately trying to find out what had happened to my grandfather. No one would tell her anything about what was going on. It turns out my grandfather had been taken to Dachau concentration camp. Dachau in 1938 was not yet an extermination camp, but it was a very cruel political prison. My grandfather and all the prisoners were woken up at dawn and forced out of the barracks and forced to stand at attention for an hour for roll call. When that was over, they were forced to march and jog around the campsite the entire day. All they had to wear were thin cotton jerseys. And we're talking about November, December in Germany. Temperatures were below freezing. The food they were given was terrible. Twice a day, they were given a bowl of thin, greasy soup and a piece of moldy bread. Many of the prisoners got sick from dysentery once they ate the food. That meant they had a very high fever, they had bloody diarrhea, and if they ever tried to eat anything afterwards, they were violently ill, vomiting. So many of the prisoners wound up dying from the combination of terrible food, sick from dysentery, and being forced to be outside with improper clothing. After 6 weeks, my grandfather was released from Dachau. And without warning, he just showed up again at my dad's apartment door. He was very, very sick. He had lost a tremendous amount of weight. He was just skin and bones, really. Barely alive, but he was alive. And he slowly started to regain his health. There's another story about Kristallnacht I'd like to share with you. My dad, once he started speaking about the Holocaust, was very interested in finding out about what happened to all of the Jews in 3 different towns in southern Germany. There was, of course, the town of Konstanz, where he was born and raised, but also the town of Geilingen, where my grandmother was born, as well as the town of Rexingen, where my grandfather and several other Ottenheimers were born. And my dad learned something very interesting about what happened during Kristallnacht at these 3 towns. And that's what I'd like to share with you. Now, what happened in Geilingen is very typical to what happened throughout all of Germany. Gestapo agents came into the town of Geilingen, told the town officials that they needed to start a protest against their Jewish neighbors. The town officials dutifully did what they were asked. They got other people together and they started this protest, this riot. They broke into the Jewish-owned stores. They went to the synagogue and they burned it down. Now, what happened in Konstanz was not quite the same as what happened in Geilingen. The Gestapo agents came to town and told the town officials that they needed to start a protest against the Jews in their town. But the officials were very reluctant to do this, and they also weren't able to find any other townspeople who were willing to do it. See, the amount of anti-Semitism in Konstanz was less than in a lot of other parts of Germany. My dad speculated that this was because Konstanz was right there on the Swiss border, and that perhaps the Nazis themselves in power wanted to tone down the anti-Semitism a little bit because they really didn't want the international community to understand what was going on inside Germany. And another reason why anti-Semitism was less was that Konstanz residents frequently crossed the border and went shopping at the next town in Switzerland, right, that was just over the border. And so maybe they saw that right over this border, Jews seemed to be perfectly normal citizens over there, and people weren't so mad or upset with them. And so maybe they were a little more skeptical about the propaganda that they were hearing once they returned back over the border to Konstanz. Anyways, since the townspeople seemed unwilling to start this protest against the Jews, the Gestapo agents took matters into their own hands. They went to the Konstanz synagogue, broke into it, and started a fire. The fire didn't catch, though, because the building had recently been made fireproof. It did, however, generate a lot of smoke. So one of the neighbors saw the smoke, didn't like that the synagogue was on fire, and called the fire department. The fire department showed up, and they were perfectly willing to put out the fire. They didn't care who owned the building. That was their job as firemen. The Gestapo agents ordered the firemen back to their station. After several failed attempts to set the building on fire, the Gestapo agents contacted a demolition squad in a neighboring town. The squad showed up, wired the building with explosives, and blew it up. And that's what woke my dad up in the middle of the night, was the sound of the explosives going off. Then there's the town of Rexingen. In Rexingen, as in Konstanz, the Gestapo agents were unable to convince anyone to start a protest against their Jewish neighbors. So the Gestapo agents took matters into their own hands there as well. They went to the Rexingen synagogue, broke into it through the front door, went inside, started a fire, and ran back out through the front door. As soon as they left, some of the Rexingen firemen and policemen snuck into the synagogue through the back door, put out the fire, looked around, saw what looked like some important religious artifacts, grabbed them, including the synagogue's Torah, and snuck back out through the back door. It turns out that Rexingen is one of the few synagogues throughout all of Germany that did not get burned down during Kristallnacht. And the Rexingen Torah eventually made its way to Israel, where it's now on display in a museum. When I heard this story, one of the things that I wondered about was what made Rexingen different from all of the other towns in Germany. And this is what I learned. Rexingen was a very poor town, and everyone was equally poor on the same low socioeconomic level. And it was the sort of town where everyone was always willing to help out their neighbors. If someone got sick or something happened to their home or their farm, everyone else would chip in and do whatever it took to help that person out, to get them back on their feet again. And so over the years, this community built up these extremely strong and close ties of community and friendship. And it turned out those ties were stronger than the propaganda that they were all being inundated with by the Nazis. Something to think about. Well, a few months after my grandfather was released from Dachau in April of 1939, the US consulate contacted my dad's family and informed them that their second application to immigrate to the US had come up for review, and this time had been approved. So in May of 1939, when my dad was 14 years old, the family packed up their things, boarded a train, took it to France, then boarded a ship which sailed them across the Atlantic so that they could start their new lives in New York, here in the United States. I'd like to skip ahead quickly a couple of years to 1944. My dad made it through middle school, made it through high school, and in June of 1944, he graduated from high school. Also in June of 1944, my dad enlisted in the US Army. Now, my dad couldn't be drafted because he wasn't yet a US citizen, but he felt that he really needed to be part of the US efforts to fight back against Nazi Germany. And so he volunteered, he enlisted. And so after this whole process of enlisting and going through his physicals and going through basic training, finally, in March of 1945, my dad was deployed to Europe, to Germany, back to his homeland as a US soldier. Now, my dad was originally trained as an infantry rifleman, but once he got to Germany, he was reassigned to a group called the Military Government Security Guard because he could speak German fluently. What this group did was go into a town that had been recently taken over by US forces. And they would pick someone who had never been a member of the Nazi party and say, "You're now the mayor," and find someone else to become the police chief. And they would make sure that electricity was working and food was coming in, all the utilities were functioning properly, make sure that the town could basically manage on its own. And then the group would move on and do it again in the next town. In April, my dad's team arrived in the German city of Leipzig. Shortly after they got there, they were asked to come investigate a small camp located outside the town. They discovered that it had been a forced labor camp. About 300 slave laborers, mostly foreigners from Poland, Belgium, and France, and these people were not Jewish. They were forced to stay in this camp while they worked during the days at a nearby manufacturing plant. The night before, the US forces were scheduled to arrive in Leipzig, freeing the city and freeing this camp. The guards at that camp forced all of these laborers into one of the buildings, nailed boards over the doors and windows of the building, and set the building on fire. Most of these laborers died in this blaze. Some of them tried to escape from the building by climbing down into the latrine trench. But when they came out of the trench outside the building, they were shot dead by these guards. When my dad got there, along with his team, a few days afterwards, he looked around at the burned down building and all the dead bodies, and he wondered, how could anyone have done this? How could these guards have possibly felt justified, have felt that this was the right thing to do? But now we know this was not an isolated case. At all of the Nazi extermination centers, thousands of Germans dutifully supported the systematic massacre of millions of people. Well, that was April of 1945. In May of 1945, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. My dad wound up staying in Europe, in Germany, for another year, assisting with the denazification efforts, before he was sent back to the US and then discharged. That, however, is not quite the end of the story for my dad and his family. I'd like to take just a couple minutes now to talk about a few other people, starting with my dad's very close relatives who lived in France, the Wertheims. Uncle Leon, Aunt Martha, and cousin Gigi. Aunt Martha was my grandmother's sister, and Gigi was 1 year younger than my dad. The two families used to vacation together frequently. My dad and his family would go to France and spend time with them at their home. Once my dad and his family came here to the US, my grandmother and Aunt Martha still used to write letters to each other all the time. Well, in the spring of 1940, Germany invaded France and immediately started to persecute all of the Jews living in France. Still, my grandmother and Aunt Martha were able to send letters to each other. However, in 1942, suddenly, without any advance warning, the letters from Aunt Martha stopped arriving. When World War II was over, my dad's family tried to find out what happened. They learned that in July of 1942, Uncle Leon, Aunt Martha, and Gigi were deported from their homes in France to the Auschwitz extermination camp, where they were murdered. This picture that I'm showing you, it was taken of Gigi and my dad when my dad was on his way to the US. My dad and his family took that train to France, stayed overnight with the Wertheims, and then got on the ship the next day. Gigi was 13 years old in this picture. She was 16 years old on the day she was forced out of her home, forced onto a train, sent to Auschwitz, and murdered by the Nazis on the day that she arrived. Guilty of nothing except being Jewish. This last picture I'd like to share with you is a picture that I took a time that I visited Konstanz. My dad, once he started to talk about the Holocaust, went back to Konstanz several times. A few times, he was actually invited back by the mayor of Konstanz. And on 3 occasions, I was able to go with him. I have lots of pictures of Konstanz, but this is the one that I'd like to share with you now. It is a memorial to all of the Jews of Konstanz who were murdered by the Nazis during the Holocaust. My dad and his family were very lucky to escape Germany. As I told you, it took 3 years for that application for immigration process to come to fruition. My dad and his family applied in 1936, and it was May of 1939 when they finally were able to leave Germany. Well, in September of 1939, Germany invaded Poland, and that disrupted the flow of immigrants from Germany to the US. In another year or so, that the immigration process was completely shut down. So if it had just taken a few more months for that application process, it's quite possible that my dad and his family would not have ever had their application approved, and they would never have been able to come to the US. So what would have happened then? Well, In October of 1940, all of the Jews that were still living in Constance and the surrounding area were forced out of their homes and sent to the Gurs internment camp in France. They were forced to remain in that camp until 1942, when they were deported again, this time forced to go either to the Sobibor extermination camp or the Auschwitz extermination camp, where they were then murdered. So this monument lists the names of all the Jews of Constance who were murdered by the Nazis. My dad and grandparents could very easily have had their names on this monument as well. So these were some of the stories that my dad used to tell about the Holocaust. It's one person's story or one family's story, one town's story, perhaps. I believe it's very important to tell these personal stories, to hear them being told, because it's hard to grasp the horrors of the Holocaust when you're just reciting numbers. So I thank the Holocaust and Humanities Center for organizing this speaker series, and I really appreciate all of you that took time today to join us and listen to my dad's stories. Thank you very much.
And thank you so much for sharing this story with our community and for being with us today. I also really love you integrating upstanders. So thank you for doing that, because I also think a lot of the work we do here at the museum is trying to help people understand that anyone can be an upstander, but we do have to choose to take that first step to affect change. And I just really appreciate you adding that into your talk today. And I'm sure it resonates with many people because the way you tell this story is very powerful. So thank you again for being with us today. Someone named Becky also said, thank you for sharing. I appreciate you sharing about your dad. Couldn't agree more. It's great to hear stories that maybe we wouldn't hear every day because you're not here in Cincinnati. So I do appreciate you joining us via Zoom. One question sent by Mitchell, thanks for submitting it, says, why didn't your grandfather and family go to Switzerland like the Austrian families he helped? And if you know the answer.
Well, I've been asked that before. It's an excellent question. And I think that it was a very, very stressful situation to be there. And if my grandparents knew that if they just went into Switzerland, life would not be very good for them. Once refugees from Austria, Germany, if they came into Switzerland, if they didn't have anywhere else, some other country they could go to, they were forced to stay in refugee camps. And these refugee camps were not great places to live. And it was really unclear whether people would ever be able to leave those refugee camps. So it was what my grandparents had to struggle with every day was what would be less worse, staying in Constance where there's persecution, but at least we still have an apartment. And I think my grandfather got a pension from the military. And so they had enough money to survive, versus would life be so much worse, or better if they were to go into Switzerland and wind up in a refugee camp. And so that was sort of every day you had to think about what might happen to us here versus what might happen to us somewhere else. And I think that's why they were pushing so hard to come to the United States, because at least they knew that if they were approved for immigration, they wouldn't have to stay in a camp. They would be allowed to work, they would be allowed to get an apartment and so forth.
Yes, thank you for answering that question. Let's see. Someone named Lori submitted a comment. I knew your mom and dad from our shared years at Temple Sinai. They were fine people. I have heard your father's story and know how proud Fritz would be of you for keeping his story alive. So thank you, Lori, for submitting that comment. That is beautiful. And that is one thing actually that leads me to a question I have about how did you decide to start sharing this story, and how does this history and also, you know, having this legacy affect you? Has it inspired you in any way, or how, as a second generation, does this impact you?
Well, initially, you know, because I didn't know my family's history, and then I sort of got it in dribs and drabs. It didn't really hit me very suddenly that this was something, you know, very vital and important that my family experienced that I needed to make sure people understood. It's more something that built up over time. But I could see, as my dad spoke, how it really affected people who he gave his talks to. People who would come back a few years later and talk about how it really changed their lives. And I realized how important it was for people to understand that it, you know, not just about the Holocaust, but that hatred, unchecked hatred, can be devastating to any community. One of the first things I wound up doing while my dad was still alive, but still while he was in his 80s, getting on in years, was I started to be a instructor for a program in bystander intervention training. This is something where, you know, when people see hate speech in public and they're sort of frozen, they don't know what to do. So this was a 2-hour workshop that gives people some ideas on how you can sort of unfreeze yourself and do something hopefully safe to intervene. And this was something my dad was very happy that I was starting to get involved in, because he had thought that I really wasn't that influenced by what he was doing. But really what it was is I felt like he was the much better speaker than me in terms of telling his story, being able to explain firsthand what happened. And so I did feel that when he was no longer going to be able to do it, I really had to continue to tell these stories to get people to understand what hatred would do if left to fester.
Yeah, well, and I couldn't agree more with Lori's comment again of how proud he would be of you keeping this story and this legacy and really inspiring other people to be upstanders, right? That's an incredible aspect of your storytelling. And I just want to thank you again for being a part of the Holocaust Speaker Series this week, all the way from the East Coast. Again, it just blows my mind the stories that are out there that we have not heard yet. So thank you so much for bringing this story to our community. To everyone who joined us on Zoom and Facebook Live, thank you for tuning in this week. Again, I am coming to you from the Nancy and David Wolf Holocaust and Humanity Center here in Cincinnati. But I also want to thank my colleagues who put me in touch with Dan, that he is on their Generation Speakers Bureau at the Holocaust Center of Pittsburgh. So thank you again to my colleagues for connecting me with Dan so that we could share this incredible story with you today. And thank you again to our sponsors, Michael and Margaret Valentine. And we will be back again next week with another weekly Holocaust Speaker Series. And until then, everyone be well. And Dan, thank you again for being with us. Take care.